Special edition Chatterbox Bengals. New hire, new DC in the building. Louis Anarumo out. Al Golden in, a familiar face in Cincinnati. Actually never left. Still has a house in Cincinnati, moving back home, as some would say. And I think it's a really good hire. I guess that's how we'll start it. How are the off the cuff vibes when you got the alert? We've been talking about it for a few days. Not exactly a surprise, but certainly a big news.
Right, it's hard to gauge like how you feel when it's something that you already knew was going to happen, right? We knew this was kind of going to happen. The fact that the whole DC talk had gone quiet for a week, other than saying Al Golden's the leading candidate, and we're like, all right, well, they're just going to wait till Al Golden's national championship's done. They waited till it's done. They did the precursor interview, and then he's the new coach. And I go into both camps, right? Because I think there's a large contingent of Bengals fans that wanted something new. I've always been the idea that getting as much information in as possible, getting like as many different opinions, as much experience as possible is always good, right? You want someone that worked under a lot of different teams, a lot of different head coaches. But I also recognize that Al Golden's a pretty good defensive coach, right? Like
Right.
He's been really good. So I get why people are upset, because it feels like the Bengals took the easy road and just, hey, this guy was here when our defense played pretty well, honestly. He was here and kind of helped guide the linebacking crew and guide this defense, and he parlayed that into some more success. But it also, I don't know, he's a good coach. So how can you get upset? And I think that if you look at what has happened recently with Al Golden, he has taken a team that, Notre Dame, a defense that in every big game had pretty much no-showed for the entirety of that program for the last 3 decades, and he made them incredibly competent in big-time games. So, yeah, I'm excited, but I also get where people are coming from when they are concerned about just rehashing and taking the easy road.
For sure. And a familiar face for all Chatterbox Bengals viewers, Craig Sandlin joining us as well, the three-headed monster to talk about one of the big 3 Bengals coaches getting a big change. So, yeah, this one is one we've saw coming for a while, Craig, and a candidate we've talked about for a while, as I just said, for Reed. How are you feeling off the cuff with this first hire?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on board with this hire. I think there's a couple of things that we've talked about that this Bengals team needs in their next defensive coordinator. First and foremost is that there's a lot of young talent on this team that still needs to be developed.
Right.
And whether we want to admit it or not, one of the prime responsibilities, especially at the collegiate level, is developing talent. And Al Golden, for a long time, has shown that ability. And so for me personally, I'm excited about what he's going to be able to do with this young crew. I like that he's aggressive. They played more man than pretty much any defense in the country over the course of the last couple of years. And that led to Notre Dame, since he arrived in 2022, having the number 6 overall defense during that time span in all of college football. So we're talking about a guy who's been able to develop prospects, build them up, get them ready. And there's been a lot of talk about, retread hires and bringing guys back in that are familiar with the organization. And we'll get into all of that. But ultimately, from my perspective, Al Golden's background makes a lot of sense for what the Bengals needed in their next defensive coordinator. Whether or not they have the talent to play his style will be interesting. But I've also seen him talk about the fact that he can build a style around the talent that he has. So I'm excited for it. I'm on board with the hire, and looking forward to chatting about it today.
Exactly what you said right there at the end, building a style around your staff, any around your roster. Any good coach, that's what they do. Obviously, coaches are known for certain systems and certain plays and stuff like that, but you always mold it to the people you have. And the main talking point over the last 24, 48 hours after the national championship game is that Al Golden was outmatched in talent in that game, and Bengals fans are saying, well, we don't have the most talented defense, so why would we go get this guy? This is a guy, like Craig just said, who's had a top 10 defense his entire tenure at Notre Dame. When he was in Cincinnati as the linebackers coach, these linebackers were viewed as maybe the best duo in the entire league, and Jermaine Pratt and Logan Wilson, viewed high enough that we extended them both long term. I think anyone talking themselves out of Al Golden, they'd be excited that the Bengals hired him if he hadn't worked for the Bengals before. I think if you look at his history and everything he's done in his career as a defensive coach, I think if it wasn't an old Bengals coach that everyone's so quick to turn their nose up at, I think more people would be thrilled about this one. He was unanimously viewed as the best defensive coordinator in college football this year throughout the regular season, and talked about highly as an NFL jump kind of guy. This isn't a reach by any means, and it fits the price range and it fits the years range. I think something that a lot of people brushed over with the talks about Robert Saleh or a lot of those other guys that had ex-head coaching jobs is that if that works as well as we thought it would, that's a 1 or 2 year DC, and then he's out of here to be a head coach somewhere else. Al Golden is probably here for a lot longer than that if it's working out the way we all think it's going to. So I think this works for the Bengals in a lot more ways than one. I was really shocked to see how many people were sour about this move.
It is interesting to see fans, for lack of a better term, always want to complain about something, right? Like you always want to poke something, especially when it is boring. And that's what this move is.
Yeah.
So like if you want to label one word to describe this move, it's boring. I saw someone on Twitter say it's a B to B plus hire. It's an F process of how we got there. I think that Al Golden was circled pretty early on in the whole DC search as like, hey, this is our guy.
Yeah.
He's been around here before. And I think we all know that. But that's what fans like exciting. We like shiny things. This is a boring hire. And boring's good. Boring is oftentimes good, right? Like everyone likes the big flashy run game on the offense or passing game, throw for 500 yards and everything like that. The teams that win often run for 170 yards a game. They run it 30 times. They play action. They do the boring things. And I think Greg said it best when he said, if this guy wasn't in the Bengals system, we would be excited about it. And that's on the head on the nail, right? That is absolutely true. If it was someone foreign, if it wasn't someone that had been in this system, we would sit there and go, oh my God, how great is this? Especially if he just went to a national championship and made Notre Dame look competitive. But yeah, I think the reason that people are upset is just because it's not the most exciting move. Make it a bad move. In fact, I would argue that most boring moves are good moves because it's just this simple thing to do. Oftentimes, the what's that psychological thing? The most likely thing is what it is. Sometimes the most boring thing is what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, and I don't know if you guys just saw it, but some additional breaking news is that Al Golden is expected to hire Jerry Montgomery, defensive line coach from the New England Patriots, as his new defensive line coach. So that's coming out of Paul Dehner. So Montgomery spent last season with New England and was previously the defensive line coach with the Packers from 2018 to 2023. So not only do the Bengals have their new defensive coordinator, but they also have their new defensive line coach. I'd expect this staff to come together fairly quickly, not only given the connections with Al Golden from his previous time, but just in general. It seems like this has been something that's been pretty well known for the last several days that Al Golden was going to be the hire. So not surprised that they were able to move quickly on a defensive line coach. Expect them to wrap up the rest of their hires. But I do want to talk a little bit about the process.
Right.
And I think that's probably the one thing that has gotten the most criticism. And from my perspective, maybe rightfully so, but at the same time, look, I having worked in athletics, I'm not going to act like I know how NFL coaching searches work, but any administrator or leader in the athletics world has their list. Like, I promise you that Zach Taylor, before he even made the decision to let go of Lou Anarumo, knew who he wanted to talk to about this job. And he had vetted some of those candidates before he ever let Lou go to have the conversations of who do I want to look at for my next step. So is it, I don't want to call it disappointing, but do a lot of fans, rightfully so, wish that they had cast a further net? I understand that perspective, but I also think that there's value in knowing what you're looking for and getting it. And I think what would have been a bigger issue is if you were facing something like the Jaguars are facing with their head coaching search right now, where you couldn't get your number one target or your number two target, or maybe even beyond that, because people didn't want to come be your defensive coordinator. Jacob and I talked about it before when Lou was officially let go, that this is, and rightfully so, is the most attractive defensive coordinator job in the NFL right now, given the state of the offense and some of the young talent that you have on the defensive side of the ball too. So are you, either of you guys, concerned about the process and the fact that at least publicly we only really spoke to 3 guys?
I'm concerned about the process if it doesn't work. If you have a guy in your mind before the offseason and you don't go try anything else and you bring that guy in and it fails, then yeah, I'm going to go back and say the process was terrible. But if they knew their guy and they got their guy and their guy turns out to be a really good defensive coordinator, then round of applause to them for knowing what to do before you let Lou leave the building. I don't know. I think it's tough to grade that without knowing how it works out. Obviously, that's not a good answer or one that you wanted, but I'd like the Bengals to go out and interview more people. But I think if you're confident in who you have in the list and your top guys available, and you think he wants to come to Cincinnati, then why waste the time interviewing anyone else?
I think that everyone that is concerned, and like I said, I'm halfway in that. Everyone's concerned about the process and, just the rehash of a hire and, gave our process an F and all that stuff, are also the same people that threw around names like, we should go get Robert Saleh, we should go get Dennis Allen, which if we get it, that'd have been great, right? That's fantastic.
Yeah.
But as we know, as Bengals fans, we're kind of working with one arm behind our back, and those weren't ever real considerations, despite being absolutely right when they said this is one of the better DC jobs in the NFL, because there's a very low bar that you have to clear to be successful as a team and as a defensive coach, because the offense is going to put up so many points, and you've got also some talented, I don't want to say great, some talented young players. So yeah, I don't know. I think everyone that is concerned about the process are the same people that wanted the Bengals to go out and get the Robert Saleh, go out and get the Dennis Allen, which once again would have been great, but that was never realistic. So let's work in the world of reality. Like if we could, I wish we could fire Zach Taylor right now and bring back prime Vince Lombardi, but we can't do that because that's just not possible. So let's not talk about getting Dennis Allen or Robert Saleh. Let's talk about the real guys, the guys that have been in the building and that have been very successful in other places and have worked under other great defensive-minded coaches like Marcus Freeman, for instance. So yeah, I think everyone's just going to complain, and that's just part of the world.
A good point our chat brings up is if you thought Lou was hurt by lack of talent and development and being bad in the draft, then a great way to fix that is to go get a college coach. That's exactly what Craig said right off the rip, is that's what they do. That's the biggest part of their job, is bringing these guys along to a point where they can play and go translate to the NFL. And this Notre Dame defense has a lot of guys that we've already talked about being potential Bengals pre the Al Golden hire. Guys like Xavier Watts, the linebacker, I'm blanking on his name now, but a team captain. A lot of guys that fit the Bengals mold that we were talking about before, guys that Al Golden had gotten to a point where we're talking about them as NFL products. And now we have guys that now are already in the NFL, so ideally more talented than a college defense, and hopefully he can get some of these first-round picks up to where we thought they could be. We never know what a guy like Miles Murphy or Dax Hill could be in a different system, in a different coach, with different words going through their ears. Maybe they're going to get to a point where we don't look at them as busts in a couple years, and I think that's the biggest thing when looking at this defense is we're never going to go out and sign 9-10 guys. So getting someone that you believe in development and getting these guys along and knowing how to watch college film and think about how it's going to translate to the NFL, I think that's a great part of this hire as well.
Well, and what you just talked about is an important piece. Sorry. I was just going to say an important piece of this is that it's not only developing the players, but it's identifying the potential in those players from the beginning. Again, these college coaches are identifying high schoolers who, when they bring them in, typically have to add anywhere from 30 to 50 pounds in order to be where they want to be in terms of a defensive lineman. They have to work on other things based on other positions. So these guys are being identified and basically recruited as part of this job as a defensive coordinator to come in and basically develop them. So, similarly, when we're talking about Al Golden and the development that he's had with some of these collegiate, studs. I mean, I look at a guy like Kyle Hamilton, who I think was there for Al Golden's first year. If I'm wrong, I apologize, but I think they overlap for a year. So, you talk about this first round talent in Kyle Hamilton and the meteoric rise that he really saw towards the end of his collegiate playing career into being a top 15 draft pick. Those are the types of things that you're looking for from this defensive coordinator. And certainly, you mentioned Xavier Watts. Safety is going to be a need, whether or not they go with Xavier Watts or somebody else will be seen. But the fact of the matter is that Al Golden has many, many years of experience of identifying young talent before they ever get on campus and then developing them once they do.
And you guys are hitting home the points about why we are in the position that we are now is because we haven't been able to develop. And it's not just about developing the talent that's here. This is the plan for the Bengals going forward because we got to spend money on the offense. The money's going to be wrapped up in Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, Orlando Brown, Amarius. It's going to be wrapped up on the majority of the offensive side of the ball. The days of a great majority of free agent signings are going to come on the defense. They're kind of going by the wayside. We might have a year more left of that, but we've got to start hitting on this young talent because that's the mold that these teams that win Super Bowls do. That's what the Chiefs do, right? They just draft defensive guys and develop them. Maybe you have one franchise-changing guy like Chris Jones on the Chiefs, like we have in Trey Hendrickson, but the rest of the guys are just plug and play, and you hope that you can develop and you hope that you can kind of build a great defense through developing. It's not just about what's been missing here. It's about what the plan is going forward, and that is the key of development.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you guys saw this, I'm trying to find it now. There was somebody on social media that was trying to say that this wasn't Zach Taylor's hire. Did you guys see that tweet that this was a Mike Brown hire, not a Zach Taylor hire? Wow. I'll see if I can find it again.
That would be surprising to me. That would be surprising to me. Especially with the verbiage and everything he said after firing the other coaches, taking so much control of making those moves. Whether that's true or not, the fact that it's released is at least surprising if it is true.
It's
and again,
really
I don't
funny
even remember who I saw it from.
It's really funny to think about that it is Mike Brown. If it is Mike Brown, the one that did this, because it'd just be like, all right, Zach, we fired this guy. And then, hey, Mike's just sitting there. He's just going, hey, who's that guy we had here a couple years ago? Who was that guy, that Al guy? Isn't he over at Notre Dame? Let's hire that guy. And that's just how he works. He just doesn't know any other defensive coordinators around the league. He's just like, do we have a guy in here that's kind of doing okay? It's just go ahead and call that guy up. We'll bring him around. But it looks like Jimbo's coming in here. So if that's the plan, I'll get the heck out.
We were going to keep you around. I was going to send Craig away, but that's up to you, Reader. We'll talk to you later. Thanks for joining us. That's on me. Still getting used to the triple box on the production side of things. Thought I could do that and then cross it over.
I'm leaving. See you guys.
See you, Reader. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks, Reed.
Oh, no. What's that? What is that?
That's incredible. Well, we have a Notre Dame insider joining us now, and Jimmy Collins in the middle of the triple box, ex-Chatterbox intern, current Notre Dame student, most recently national championship game loser. Jimmy, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it. Sorry to take your happiness and your defensive coordinator.
It's okay. It's okay. It felt like perfect. I don't know. It felt like the whole time he was going to go to the Bengals. I think that's where it seems to have been trending for a couple months now. Definitely disappointing on my end, but I think it's a good hire personally.
And that's the biggest thing I was going to ask. We're hammering the point home right now that the biggest part about this whole thing is the development. And we've talked about that with the Bengals forever and how our guys just aren't where we want them to go. How had he impacted the Notre Dame team in that way since he got there in terms of how he elevated the level of play in the entire unit and the different position groups at Notre Dame?
Yeah, I just think that the most important thing with Al Golden was just how he was able to plug and play guys into this defense after guys went down. Notre Dame lost a lot of talent on defense this year. Two of their best players they lost one with Riley Mills against Indiana, and how he was able to kind of fill his role with Gabe Rubio and Donovan Heinisch to continue to win games in the college football playoff. But then the most notable guy being Ben Morrison, who he went down against Louisville, and he called it a season. He's definitely a first round draft talent. So seeing how he was able to uh, plug in guys like Leonard Moore, a freshman who he had a great end to the season, and he made a lot of plays. He had that run where he chased down, I believe it was Henderson or Judkins in that
Judkins.
playoff game. But he did that a couple times this year, forced a couple fumbles. He's a very big talent, and yeah, it's too bad to see him go. Notre Dame's defense was very strong the past 2, 3 seasons now, ever since he came in. But I think he's gonna leave Notre Dame with a good foundation for hopefully a championship run in the future. I mean, they were close this year, but definitely with the Bengals, who it seems like their defense was not quite up to par um, this past season. I think Al Golden, he'll be comfortable there, and I think he'll be able to fill in just fine.
Putting it kindly, Jimmy. Look, there was a lot of talk leading up to the national championship game about Al Golden's aggressiveness and the fact that they wanted to go man on man a lot, and just the type of defense that he likes to play. For those of us that didn't see a whole lot of Notre Dame and Notre Dame's defense prior to that national championship game or prior to the playoffs, tell us about what you saw out of the defense throughout the course of the season, and what you think will kind of translate over to the Bengals.
Yeah, I think Notre Dame throughout the regular season, I would say they didn't have the toughest schedule. I think they faced a couple tests, whether it be on the road against A&M in week one, or Army Navy, who at the time were ranked and undefeated at the time. So the defense played really well. I think they had a couple slip ups with Louisville, a team that had some talented wide receivers and a talented quarterback, and then USC, obviously with the copious amounts of talent that they had, they just weren't able to put it all together. But one thing that Notre Dame did well is they didn't go away from what worked. They ran a lot of man coverage. They ran man coverage about 60% of the time. And going into the national championship game, a lot of people were thinking that Notre Dame was going to have to change it up to have a chance to win, which, I mean, looking back on it now, that's probably true. But they, Al Golden basically told his guys, and Leonard Moore came out last week and said, we're not gonna change. We're gonna keep doing what we've been doing because we believe in this process, and we believe in the guys that we have on this team to be able to run man coverage against the 3, 4, 5 NFL level skill position players that Ohio State had. And yeah, I mean it didn't go as well as we had hoped, but yeah, I mean Al Golden believes in his guys, and I think he'll believe in the Bengals the same way to be able to um, you know change the copious amount of points that they gave up last season, and make life a little bit easier for their offense.
That's all we want. That's all we want. And if Al Golden can bring a couple of those studs on that Notre Dame defense with him in the draft, that would be phenomenal. I think that there's a couple of guys we've already had circled and talked about tonight. But Al Golden's confidence in his guys, exactly what you said right there, the belief in his system. There's a worry about that system and how it's going to translate to the NFL. He already talked about how he's going to modify that to better fit his roster. The man-to-man allegiance kind of is something that scares me. He didn't necessarily show a willingness to get away from that, and it might have cost him. I just wonder how malleable he'll be in the NFL, how stuck in his ways he is. For a guy that hasn't coached in the NFL, I think it's kind of unique to have that worry, but with a guy who's so established at the college level, I just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Jacob and I talked about a little bit before how um, much more he wants a guy like Xavier Watts now, or maybe even Benjamin Morrison. I mean, those are two guys that Al Golden developed very well, and I think there will be a couple more coming up throughout the next couple of years.
And that's the thing to look at, especially with a college coach, connections throughout the years. Obviously, not only just guys that went to Notre Dame. Al Golden, as a defensive coordinator at a blue chip program, has recruited every 5-star, 4-star, 3-star. So when these guys are coming through the NFL draft, I don't know how much it means. We never do, but they know Al Golden's name. They're familiar with that process, and maybe that does help the Bengals at least get a leg up on maybe some of those mid-round players, the sneakier guys that Al Golden knows of that other people don't.
Yeah, so I guess where do you guys stand with this hire? I mean, I think it's a great hire personally, but I might have a little
I
bias.
was thrilled. I was thrilled. He was a name I threw out in every single episode after the Lou Anarumo firing as a guy I expected the Bengals to consider. And as Reed said a little bit earlier, I think everyone that's upset about this hire, and it's something that we talked about as well, wanted guys that were never going to be the Bengals defensive coordinator. This is the best of the realistic options, in my opinion. I think Patrick Graham, who was always listed as the finalists with Al Golden, was the fallback if Golden didn't want to leave Notre Dame, and I don't think the Bengals, we don't have terms of a contract or anything like that, right, Craig? I don't believe I haven't seen anything. I've been trying to refresh, but I would imagine they didn't go too far above what he was making at Notre Dame. He was reported to be making about $2 million at Notre Dame, which is more than Lou Anarumo made to be the Bengals DC over the last however many years. So I think the worry there, where they were holding Patrick Graham with him for as long as they could, was if Golden wouldn't take that minuscule pay jump, if there is a pay jump, to come to the NFL. But since he did, I think he's been their guy for a long time, and I think that holds a lot of merit in how much they believe in him, what he's going to be able to do in terms of how confident they were in hiring him right away.
Yeah, our friends over at Gridiron Grading, Jacob, put out a tweet recently that kind of broke down what Al Golden was able to do at Notre Dame with, respectfully, Jimmy, lower talent than many other big-time programs, right? So in 2023, Notre Dame was number 6 in defensive EPA per play, and in 2024, meaning their 2023 class, they had 5 draft picks, all of them round 3 or later. Marist Liafau, you'll correct me, Cam Hart, J.D. Bertrand, Javante Jean-Baptiste, and then this year, number 2 in defensive EPA per play, and at least according to Gridiron Grading, maybe one day 2 guy and then a couple day 3 guys, but again, no real like top end talent. So to be able to have that kind of success at Notre Dame, which again, I know you said that isn't the toughest schedule, but at the same time, every year they're playing teams like USC and they have their rivalry games that certainly provide plenty of opportunity for tough matchups. And Notre Dame's been able to kind of match that without the top end talent, of recent, at least. We talked about Kyle Hamilton already, but over the last 2 years has been able to do more with less at Notre Dame. So that's intriguing to see nonetheless. But also goes to the conversation that we had earlier about developing talent. And ultimately, some of these guys came in, weren't necessarily 5-star defensive players, but he was able to turn them into draft picks and was able to get the most out of his defense without having the top end talent that maybe other teams have. So I'm excited about it, Jimmy. I'm interested to see what kind of system he decides to go with this Bengals personnel. I'm also excited to see what, if any, input he's able to give into personnel decisions, whether it be some of the cuts that are looming, that are expected, some of the draft picks that are expected to be needed to be spent on the defensive side of the ball. It'd be interesting to see if at all this changes their attack to the draft as it pertains to the defensive side of the ball, because I would assume that Zach and Lou were pretty hand in hand in that. So it'll be interesting to see. But talk about, Jimmy, just I guess from your perspective, going into the draft and some of these decisions from free agency and cuts. What are the type of athletes that Al Golden likes to see in certain positions? Are there certain, attributes that he likes to use in certain scenarios? Like, what should we expect from a personnel side?
Yeah, I think most importantly, in the secondary, he was just very straightforward, and like we're going to rely on these guys because we have talented players back there, and I think the Bengals secondary last season, I think that was a bit of an issue. So I think that definitely I would be surprised if he came into Cincinnati and didn't look to make an upgrade there, whether it be through the draft or kind of push the front office to make a move to really strengthen that secondary. And in Notre Dame's defense saw a lot of young guys have to come in this year because of injuries in the secondary on the defensive line. Uh, Down three defensive ends or three defensive linemen very quickly this season. And in the secondary, you lose a player that was looking to be a high first round pick coming into this year. And obviously has kind of fallen down that board quickly with his hip injury. But Notre Dame one thing they did really well this year was uh, like never really flinched, and they had freshmen all around, and they were able to put those guys in a position to make plays, and when they did, they just continued to get better and better. And one thing I kind of want to say for the Bengals fans that may be worried because maybe the only Notre Dame game that they watched was the one that took place on Monday night, and at the end of the day, I don't think that's a very fair um, like place to compare if you think this is a good hire or not because of how talented everyone knows that Ohio State team was. And at the same time, they made the decision to stick with what was working. And I think that at the end of the day, they did the best they could. I think Ohio State was the best team in the country, the best offense in the country. So it would have taken a lot to really slow them down. But at the end of the day, uh, they they played the way that they had played the entire season, and it's disappointing to see him go. But I do think that the Bengals defense will have to make some upgrades, specifically in the secondary, because Al Golden liked to rely on the talent that he had in his secondary, and that opened up a lot of things for Notre Dame. It opened up a lot of new faces on the defensive line coming in and week out because of these injuries, and it was just this Notre Dame season was very reliant on that defense, and it was fun to watch.
It's almost the same thing Jason Fitz said on Off the Bench a couple weeks ago. Al Golden's so dependent on his guys on the outside, and the only thing that scares me about that feels like Lou Anarumo. Lou Anarumo relied on his guys to make plays on islands. Lou Anarumo needed a star safety to have a good defense in order to make a run in the playoffs. I know Al Golden was Lou's linebackers coach, and obviously they're going to have a lot of similarities when you come up through a certain guy's coaching tree, if you will. But I don't know. A lot of those things, I'm very high on the Al Golden hire. Absolutely none of that's ever changing. But a lot of the things that people say he needs and relies on remind me a lot of Lou Anarumo.
Yeah, but like you said, I think that makes sense with them
Absolutely.
having worked together. So I wouldn't overthink that. I think you just gotta be confident. He showed a lot in his 3 years at Notre Dame, and those are some of the best Notre Dame defenses that I've watched
And
in
that's the
my
biggest thing.
long
Immense
long
success
time.
outside of Cincinnati, I think, kind of erases the retread higher mindset for me. He went to Notre Dame, took control of a unit himself, got them to a level that they really haven't been to very frequently, and now he's coming back to the NFL in a place that he loves and a place that he never even moved away from full time. So I think that matters too. I mean, we talk about how much this city loves Joe Burrow and everything about him as well. I think a lot of that is because he's from Akron, because he's an Ohio guy. Al Golden loves Cincinnati, never left Cincinnati, and I think that's going to help him a lot as well as he tries to navigate through this fan base and everything else that goes with an offseason.
Yep, I definitely I agree.
I mean,
Should be
ultimately,
excited
when
though.
we're talking about, leaving, the outside guys on their own, I think one of the things this year that we saw was, we had high hopes for Geno Stone when we got him from Baltimore. And I don't think that he was really able to play Geno Stone football this year, at least early on.
Yeah.
Because he was either trying to compensate for guys on the outside or just put in different scenarios or asked to do different things. I think given Al Golden's aggressive nature, I wouldn't be surprised to see Geno Stone be able to return to his kind of ball hawking ability that we saw in Baltimore and see if he can't kind of give that same kind of bump to the Cincinnati Bengals defense that we were kind of hoping that he would give this past year. Ultimately, look, for those people that think that this is a boring hire, respectfully, we said from the beginning that the Bengals didn't need to be bringing in the best defensive coordinator of all time. And I'm not acting like Al Golden isn't a good defensive coordinator, but at the same time, this defense can be a middle of the pack defense and be a Super Bowl defense. So, Al Golden has the opportunity to go out, run his defense the way that he wants to, develop the young players to be able to fit into a system, build a system around the team that he has. And ultimately, I think that he can make an impact rather quickly, right? And again, when you had Lou Anarumo for 6 years, sometimes the voice just gets stale. And, when you're talking about a culture or a head coach who really relies on culture, sometimes that change in voice can be a benefit and kind of reset the structure and expectations. And ultimately, I think that Al Golden has the opportunity to do that. So I think for those people that are kind of bored by the hire, I would just encourage you to kind of just take a breath, think about the talent that this team has on the defensive side of the ball, including injuries that we face this year in DJ Turner, Dax Hill, and others, and see what can happen. And there's also some high draft picks on this defensive side of the ball.
Yes.
that quite frankly, we have high hopes for, that haven't developed into what we had hoped that they could develop into. But bringing Al Golden in and now Jerry Montgomery as well, I think that you can realistically maintain similar expectations for those young talent to be able to take the steps. I mean, I'm excited to see what Myles Murphy is able to do under this new system and with this new leadership, and see if he can't take that next step into becoming, a starting defensive lineman. And other guys as well, guys like Chris Jenkins, who I think showed some flashes towards the end of the year. So I'm excited for it. I think the positive side is that there's some good talent. There's also plenty of room for upgrades. And so ultimately, I think the Bengals have a lot of flexibility when it comes to the draft and free agency. We certainly know the positions that need to be upgraded or should be upgraded, but ultimately, I think there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how they allocate those resources. So
for sure,
Al Golden's going to have an opportunity to come in and put a stamp on this defense rather quickly through free agency and through the draft, because they're going to be allocating a whole lot of capital towards his side of the ball.
And Craig and I will talk about some of those roster moves here in a bit. But Jimmy, just one last question before I let you get on with the rest of your night. Are there any other coaches on that Notre Dame staff that you would really be sick losing, that would just absolutely keep you up at night if they joined Al Golden in Cincinnati? I know Jerry Montgomery already hired as the D-line coach. I had circled Al Washington when talking about Golden throughout the process as potentially being one that follows him to Cincinnati. Obviously, that won't be the case anymore. But the ones that you would be most sick losing, but especially ones that realistically could come with him.
I think the one that I would be most sick losing would be the defensive backs coach and pass game coordinator, Mike Mickens, who I think a lot of Notre Dame people seem to think that he is the guy that will take over for Al Golden here at Notre Dame. But I think a lot of people will be comfortable with that, just with how the secondary's played the last couple of seasons and the talent that they've been able to develop there, all the way from senior all the way down to freshman. But I think if they lost him with Al Golden, I think a lot of Notre Dame fans would really start to panic and not quite sure who they would get if it's not Mickens. So straight answer, yeah, Mike Mickens.
Fair enough. Well, Jimmy, I'll let you get on with your night in beautiful South Bend. Thank you so much for the time. I guess we'll call you a Notre Dame insider. You're our Notre Dame insider. Have a good one, Jimbo.
Thank you. Good to see you guys.
Well, Craig, we'll take it from here. And obviously you talked about it there, and that's what I wanted to spend the rest of our time on. The biggest thing now is where do you go from here? We knew the defense was the biggest question of the offseason, and we knew the first domino that had to fall to answer the rest of the questions on defense was who's the defensive coordinator. Now that we have that answered, and at least the two of us are thrilled about it, we have to see where else we're going to go from here. There were some interesting reports about potential defensive cuts since the last time we spoke. Jermaine Pratt getting into it on Twitter with some beat reporters about the percentage chance of himself potentially being cut. Where do you stand on that one? Because I think that's definitely the biggest one as a multi-time team captain. And I know the last time we left here, we were both almost completely sure that he was going to be a Bengal next year.
I think I still am. I think, again, you talked about it earlier. You look at what this Bengals linebacking core was able to do under Al Golden in 2020 and 2021. And like you said, we thought that Jermaine Pratt and Logan Wilson were maybe the best young duo of linebackers in all of the NFL. And I realize that his contract kind of complicates some things, but he's only due to make $5.25 million this year. If you were to cut him, the signing proration on it is 2.3 or something like that. So you're really not saving as much as you are by cutting some other players on this Bengals defensive side of the board. I think he's back. I still think that there are other, and I mean this, respectfully, but there are higher needs on this Bengals defensive side of the ball than linebacker. And I think that Jermaine Pratt, again, led the team in tackles this year. Part of that was through necessity due to Logan
could have had a bigger
injury,
lead.
but yeah. So when you talk about the cuts that are going to be happening, I have to believe that between Sheldon Rankin, Sam Hubbard, and Alex Kappa, you're going to be saving enough money to be able to assess the needs that are elsewhere. And again, Zach Moss as well, $4 million there. I think you save $3 million by cutting him. But I think that Jermaine Pratt is back. I think obviously the hope is that Logan Wilson is able to come back from his injury and be the Logan Wilson that we really relied on for the last several years.
The Logan Wilson that we saw the last time Al Golden was here.
Yeah, exactly. The one that was ridiculously flagged for a holding in the Super Bowl.
Specifically that one.
I think that this linebacking crew, especially once Logan Wilson went down, I think they struggled in pass defense, and I think Logan was probably the best pass defending linebacker that we had. And so having him back is big. It just changes the responsibilities by asking Jermaine Pratt to do so much more without having Logan Wilson on the field. So I think that they're both back this year. And again, I think given the relationship with Al Golden and at least somewhat of a familiarity with the system, I wouldn't be shocked to see, a real bit. I don't want to call it a bounce back year because Jermaine had a decent year. I mean, we obviously talked ad nauseum about the struggles in tackling from the linebacking crew this year, but I don't think that that's as much of an issue with the linebacking crew as it is that it was exacerbated by the fact that they didn't have any help. They were making so many one-on-one tackles that nobody else was around for that, most of the time that just gets picked up and you're gang tackling and you move on. But instead, because of the defense that they had, they weren't able to do that. So I think they're both back. I still think that 3 or 4 names that we talked about are likely to be let go. And I still wouldn't be surprised if there's 1 or 2 other surprises, but realistically, when you look at it, I think those 3 save you $30+ million, and that's probably enough to do what you need to do.
We talked about the biggest position need on defense with bringing in Al Golden. Jimmy agreed. Jason Fitz agreed. You agree. I agree. It's defensive backs, and we know what he wants to do, and you want to give him the talent to do what he wants to do. That's why you bring a coach in, is because you believe in their scheme, you believe in what they can do. And I think for me, defensive backfield for the Bengals is by far the hardest position to evaluate right now. You lost DJ Turner when he was playing the best football of his career, obviously a small sample size, but he gets hurt in the best game of his career. Cam Taylor-Britt takes an almost impossible step back this year. And then Dax Hill, in his first year as a full-time corner, gets hurt early enough in the season that you don't really get to see what you have. That's a lot of premier draft capital and guys we believed in not that long ago that we just don't even really know what we have either way. And I think that makes it very difficult to go out and attack that room with a lot of money in free agency or even premier draft capital in this draft, because I have a hard time believing that building doesn't believe in those guys. And we've seen enough flashes from those guys that I wouldn't be shocked if they run out next season with those three as our top three corners.
Well, and let's not forget that this secondary was put in a difficult position by the lack of pass rush on the defensive line as well, right? So there were times when they were having to guard people in the secondary for 3, 4, 5 seconds. And that's too much to ask of most corners in the NFL, let alone corners that were struggling like the Bengals defensive backs were this year. But to your point, I mean, DJ Turner in the games that he had, 68.4 PFF grade in coverage. Dax Hill, before his injury, 68.0 PFF grade in coverage prior to the injury. So I do think that there's some pieces that the Bengals were ultimately missing out on late in the season that can alter the trajectory. And then if you can realistically add one shutdown corner, and I know that that's asking a lot, and I realize that I'm putting it out there, but if you add the number one corner and then Cam Taylor-Britt becomes your number two corner, that's a big difference than Cam Taylor-Britt being your one and asked to guard wide receiver ones throughout the course of a game than it is to say, all right, I've got this real shutdown. Sauce Gardner isn't happy in New York from what we're hearing. Is there a world where he becomes back to Cincinnati? There are other, top corners in the draft that could be evaluated, but when you're looking at Cam Taylor-Britt, and he really graded as a average coverage corner this year, if you move him to a number two, that's a much better proposition for this defense. And you trust it a lot better for Cam Taylor-Britt to be left on an island in that scenario if you have the number one corner to be able to lock up the number one receiver. So, or like you said, just have Cam Taylor-Britt return to the form that he was in years past.
That'd be great.
And then you don't have an issue, right? So I think that ultimately Cam Taylor-Britt still has a place on this defense. I realize the struggles that he had this year, but his PFF grade in coverage this year was a 64.3. The last 2 years, 70.3 and 69.2. So the talent is there, the ability is there. He just needs the support, and I think having him as your number two cornerback is a lot different proposition than having him be your number one.
No question.
And quite frankly, relying on young talent on the opposite side who's unproven, that the safeties are probably trying to help because they're young and unproven and trying to learn new positions in Dax Hill or otherwise. So I think moving him to your number two corner, putting in a number one corner, allowing the safeties to properly roam, I think it changes a lot already. So I'm okay with where we're at there. I understand the desire to add there. I still lean towards the trenches, Jacob. And you talk about the number one need on this defense. The cornerback's job gets a whole lot easier if the defensive line is getting pressure.
There's no question about that.
This past year, if it wasn't for Trey Hendrickson, the Bengals would get zero pressure. So Al Golden not only needs to develop the talent that is already on this team, but they're going to need to add, as we've seen in our mock drafts that we've talked about, both edge and interior defensive line pass rush in this offseason.
Before we move on to that D-line, there's a lot of questions in the chat while we're talking about the corners, why we aren't saying Mike Hilton's name, and that's because he is a free agent. He is a free agent this year. His contract is up. A lot of questions on whether or not the Bengals plan on bringing him back. I really don't know where I stand on that one. I understand how much the veteran leadership means. I understand how great he is off the edge and in run defense, but he struggled in coverage this year, and as the season progressed, his use in coverage continued to decrease. So I don't know where you stand on the Mike Hilton contract situation. I obviously love what he's done in Cincinnati. I just don't know that it's necessarily the best move to extend him for another couple years here in stripes, because I think that Dax Hill is going to find a good home in that slot cornerback role. And I guess it comes down to whether the Bengals, Al Golden, and the rest of that defensive staff agree with me or not.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Hilton this year gave up completions on 78.3% of targets. Ultimately, just wasn't really good enough, I don't think, in the role that you need him to be. I love Mike Hilton. I think that he brings something to the table that is valuable to this defense. And when we're talking about an aggressive defense, having a guy off the corner that you can trust to blitz and pressure the quarterback is great. It's just a question of how much is that going to cost you and what's Mike Hilton going to be looking for in free agency. Is he going to be looking to try and secure a top cornerback role, or is he going to be comfortable being that nickel or dime cornerback that just isn't in there on a whole lot of passing plays? And I don't know. That'll be yet to be seen. If he does come back, then great. I mean, I thought that he did a really good job in the role that he had, but how much can you pay a guy in that type of a role on this type of a defense? That is yet to be seen.
And that's always the question, especially when you have as many holes as we have, is where do you spend the money? Because you only have so much of it. We all can't be the Dodgers. You can't just buy everyone. So the Bengals have to be conscious about where they go get their pieces. And that's why we talked about the pass rush right there before we brought up Mike Hilton. This Bengals team is most deficient, I think, at pass rush. Everything else, wherever the holes are, is okay. It obviously needs to be better to win a championship, but the pass rush in Cincinnati is abysmal, and there's really no way around it. Trey Hendrickson is a one-man show, and that's all we have. I think it's almost a unanimous opinion that that's the position we should lean at in the first round, or at least early in the draft, but I think it's important to be careful to lock yourself into one position, picking at 17 before you see how the board falls. It's important to draft good players. You don't draft positions. I think it's important to draft players, especially in Cincinnati with how many holes we have here. What do you think the answer is at edge? And I know that's a very open question, but I think it obviously starts with cutting Sam Hubbard or restructuring Sam Hubbard pretty drastically and then going from there. Joseph Ossai, also a free agent. How much do we believe in Myles Murphy? I tend to be a bigger believer than a lot of other people, but I understand why most are out on him after 2 years of almost no production. So I really don't know where we stand on the defensive line. Our second best pass rusher this year, BJ Hill, on the interior, he's a free agent as well. So there's going to be a lot of changes in that unit, a unit that was far from good enough this season, and I really don't know where they start.
Yeah, I honestly don't know either, and unfortunately, I think it's from scratch is the answer. I thought we talked about it late in the season. I thought that once they started to get creative with Joseph Ossai, that he started to show some more flashes in terms of being able to get pressure on the quarterback. But I don't know that he's like a true edge, right? Like he seemed like a guy that was roving around the line, trying to create mismatches, trying to line up over the guard a little bit more to be able to utilize his strength. It'll be interesting. I mean, we haven't really talked about it a whole lot yet, but again, the Bengals have now added a defensive line coach as well. And, you're talking about a guy who was able to develop someone like Rashawn Gary with the Green Bay Packers. And if you can turn someone like Myles Murphy into a Rashawn Gary-esque defensive edge, I think that all of us would be very happy with that. And, he always does it in his cryptic way, but Myles Murphy's brother, Max, was out on social media talking about, some of these hires before they happened and seemed to be excited about them before they were ever really announced. So maybe Myles is excited to get to work with Mac or with Jerry Montgomery as well.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately, look, the answer right now is you got to see what's out there in free agency for sure. I don't think that that's a question. But it's also going to be something that you're going to have to address in the draft and continue to add depth because unfortunately, when you have guys getting snaps like KJ Henry and Sam Hubbard, it's just not going to work out. Myles Murphy, I thought Cedric Johnson showed some flashes in the preseason, made some plays that jumped off the screen for us, but didn't do a whole lot during the season. So he's another project. It just feels like you've got Trey Hendrickson and then a bunch of projects. And I'd rather have somebody that maybe isn't so much of a project in that position.
Two of those
and imagine what that does for Trey Hendrickson does.
Absolutely. No question about it. That's something I found myself asking all year long. If he can lead the NFL with 17 and a half sacks with no other threat on the offensive or defensive line, no other threat to the offensive line, how much could he do if you just have one other rusher that's worth a damn? Who knows? We're talking 20s for sure. And that's something that makes me really excited if they are able to address this, is you could go from well below average to adding one piece and being an elite pass rush. If they have to respect someone else and Trey Hendrickson can continue to get after it as he continues to age, this can immediately turn into an elite pass rush if you hit on one signing or one pick on the opposite side. And I think that is such a cool thing to look at with this team right now, is you can get optimistic if you just talk yourself into it a little bit. The further and further we get away from week 18, you can find more and more things on this team that you can start to believe in a little bit. And I think that's a really important thing for this offseason. And with the defensive line, two of those lottery tickets, two of those wild cards from last offseason showed some pretty good flashes towards the end of the year. McKinley Jackson, Chris Jenkins both took decent steps down the back half. If those two guys can turn into viable pieces in the middle, maybe this defensive line's not quite as far away as we thought it is going into this offseason. If they really believe in those two guys and they can continue to progress as it seemed in those last couple weeks.
Well, I just think the question becomes the pass rush. I think Chris Jenkins and McKinley Jackson both showed flashes, especially in the run game.
For sure.
But when you're talking about passing, for sure, they struggled a little bit, and they're kind of projects. So when you talk about this defensive line and the interior specifically, we've already talked about Sheldon Rankins is gone. Like, that's the world's easiest cut. Sheldon Rankins
like
is gone,
not just
right?
Bengals all time, maybe like forever all time easiest cut, right, Craig?
Yeah. There's zero question that Sheldon Rankins is not back with the Bengals next year. BJ Hill, you mentioned, is a free agent. Lawrence Guy already gone. The other guys that got snaps,
I almost forgot about Lawrence Guy. It's been so long since we picked him up off the couch. Played like three games.
Let's remind you a couple more names. Zach Carter and Jay Tefeli are your other two interior defensive linemen right now on the roster. So, I mean, from my perspective, the question becomes, again, you have so many holes on this defense that it just becomes a literal question of, okay, I've got, let's say there's 7 positions that I feel like I can upgrade at in the draft, depending on what you do in free agency prior to that. Who is the best player available in those 7 positions when I draft this year? And that ultimately becomes the question. And if that's an edge, then I'm taking an edge. If that's a corner, then I'm taking a corner. If that's an offensive guard, then I'm taking an offensive guard. But I do know that I've got 6 picks at least right now, and 7 positions that I would feel comfortable drafting. And depending on the T. Higgins situation, if we draft anything other than those 7 positions, I'm probably going to be frustrated. And that's where the conversation becomes. And one other, kind of quote unquote breaking news during this whole conversation that we've been talking about is that Bengals front office executive Troy Brown getting a second interview in New York with the Jets for their open general manager job. So Troy Brown, very well respected amongst the NFL. How involved he was in the draft and in some of these decisions, I don't know, but he's very well respected and he's getting second interviews for a GM job. So he must be doing something. And we've talked at length about Duke Tobin and how we feel about the job that he's done. So if you are bringing Al Golden, you've got Zach Taylor, you potentially losing Troy Brown. What does this draft look like? That'll be the question. But for me, I think it's 7 positions. We're talking corner, we're talking safety, we're talking offensive guard, we're talking defensive line, defensive edge. Sorry. I'm still fine adding at linebacker. And probably, I guess, wide receiver becomes the 7th position, but it's, you're talking about a wide receiver 3 at this point if you're able to retain T.
Yeah. We're not talking about first round.
That should be a late round draft pick.
Yeah.
Right. So 6 positions that I'm comfortable with in the first 3 rounds, maybe. So the first 2 days, if we draft outside of those 6 positions, I become frustrated.
I like that. I like that mindset. And it was unique today, something I saw for the first time, not to get completely into draft talk. This is an Al Golden stream after all, but you brought it up as one of those positions of need. And I think it's one that kind of flies under the radar for a lot of Bengals fans. And it is linebacker. And today, Mel Kiper Jr. put out a mock draft that had the Bengals taking Jihad Campbell, Alabama's linebacker, at 17. So a linebacker in the first round kind of sets off some red flags in terms of positional value just on most nameless boards, as well as Bengals needs with Jermaine Pratt and Logan Wilson already here. That mock pick to me seems like maybe nationally there's more buzz about cutting Jermaine Pratt than there is in Cincinnati. I don't know, but that pick would really shock me if they don't move on from Pratt. If they do, definitely makes a little bit more sense, but that definitely falls into the category right there of one of those positions you named. And I think that's the biggest thing as we move into this offseason. Address the need. And that's what I just talked about a couple of years ago with drafting certain players or falling in love with a certain position. Draft good players. Sign good players. They'll find a way to get on the field. We have a lot of holes on defense. If there's a really good linebacker that wants to come to Cincinnati, bring him to Cincinnati. If there's a corner, bring him to Cincinnati. Go get good players and fill the defense with good players. We talk about positional value a lot in the draft, and that's something that I really harped on in the past, but we've seen teams like the Detroit Lions who have thrown those charts so far in the garbage and won and won and won and won. And the Bengals are a team that almost always follows positional value, taking the important positions earlier in the draft and relying later to get the other ones. And now we're looking at team need, and we're talking about safety and guard and these positions that aren't tight end, these positions that aren't usually viewed as those high-end positions. Well, you might be able to get a really, really good player at 17 because everyone else is ignoring those positions. So I think that's a really important thing to look at as we progress through this draft season as well.
Yeah, we're going to talk about this throughout the offseason, and we'll probably bring on guys like Gridiron Grading and others to talk about different prospects for you guys to be able to kind of really do a deep dive. You mentioned Mel Kiper's draft board. We put together, and I'm trying to pull it up real quick, we put together kind of a list of potential draft prospects that the Bengals could potentially look at in the draft this year, and I'm pulling it up real quick.
I'm working too.
Here we go. So the names that we had on this list: Texas A&M defensive end Nick Scorton, offensive tackle Kelvin Banks Jr. from Texas, defensive end Shamar Stewart from Texas A&M, offensive tackle Josh Simmons from Ohio State, Michigan defensive lineman Kenneth Grant, offensive guard Tyler Booker from Alabama, the guy that I think, if I remember correctly, you hope that the Bengals draft, and that's James Pierce Jr., defensive end from Tennessee. Jack Sawyer from Ohio State was on that list. Malachi Starks from Georgia was also on that list. And then Ashton Genty, the running back from Boise State, was on that list. And this was back when the Bengals were, at the number 17 pick. So for some reason, I thought we put this together before they were 17. But nonetheless, Ashton Genty, to my point, if you draft Ashton Genty in the first round, I'm extremely disappointed, regardless of the upside that he has. Extremely disappointed. Every other name on that list, the other 9, I'm open to, and even beyond that. And I know that you've watched a hell of a lot more college football this year than I did, so we'll rely on you and some of the guests that we're able to bring in to talk about that. But I mean, from my perspective, when we do our draft night show, which I'm assuming we're going to probably watch the draft, or at least when the Bengals are on the clock, we'll watch it and react. The name, respectfully for me, is going to be less important than the position. And I'm going to trust, whether they've earned this or not, probably not. I'm going to trust this front office to make the right decision. And as long as that position matches one of those 6 that we just talked about, then I'm on board.
I think that's the biggest thing right there. And now, in a little different sense, I'm with you on the position, but there's some names in some of those positions I'd be really fired up about in a bad way. And the one thing I can't stop thinking about when it comes to the first round and how locked in a lot of people are really locked in that first round has to be a defensive player. Does bringing in a new defensive coordinator, we talked about whether or not he'll have say in player personnel, does bringing in a new defensive coordinator sway you in any way that maybe they won't go defense in the first round? Or will Al Golden have personnel decisions right away? Or does that not even matter and it's just Duke Tobin and Mike Brown?
Well, whether Al Golden is involved, I think Al Golden should be involved in the process, but whether he's involved in making the pick or not, you don't fire your defensive coordinator just to turn around and not supply your new defensive coordinator with the tools that he needs in order to run his defense. So 100%, regardless of the fact that they went out and hired Al Golden, you can't just turn around and expect Al Golden to take this defense and the talent and all the holes on this defensive side of the ball and expect him to be able to turn it around immediately without any help. So no, it doesn't really change the positions for me at all. I more just meant the
likelihood that they go defense in round one.
Again, my philosophy is that you're taking best player available at those 6 positions.
Gotcha.
And if your best player available is an offensive guard, I'm totally fine with that. I think that protecting Joe Burrow is and should be your number one priority. But in order to get this team to a Super Bowl, I think the defense has to be addressed. And so whether or not it's on round 1, round 2, round 3, I don't think it changes a whole lot from my perspective. They're going to put together their draft board, and whoever the number one option is at one of those positions that they have a need in, that's who you draft. And I don't think it changes the odds a whole lot. The truth of the matter is that 5 of the 6 positions are on the defensive side of the ball. Yeah. So the odds are good that you're probably going defense. And from everything I've read so far, there seems to be some pretty good depth on the defensive side of the ball this year in the draft to be able to make the right pick. And I say this hesitantly, knowing that this front office will find a way to do it, but it feels like there's enough depth, at least in my eyes, where you, as long as you stick to your guns, you're not going to be able to really mess it up too bad.
I would agree. I would 100% agree. And I think that's famous last words, right? For especially this Bengals front office going into a draft. You can't mess it up. But it's important for Bengals fans to remember, too, when you hear everyone else talk about this draft in this offseason and how bad it is, and it's a terrible draft class. That always just means quarterbacks. And we have our quarterback. And outside of the quarterbacks, this is a really good draft class. One of the, I don't know if you can say it before they're in the league, but at least on paper, one of the better draft classes outside of quarterback in recent history. This is an incredibly deep class, especially at the positions the Bengals need. So don't freak out when you hear people say it's a bad draft class. They're just talking about quarterbacks, and the Bengals certainly have theirs. In terms of Al Golden, circling back around, Bengals hired defensive coordinator Al Golden from Notre Dame. We're here breaking it down. Thank you to everyone who joined us. If you're in here watching, make sure you like the stream, leave us a comment, hop in the chat. We thank you all for joining us. We're both pretty happy about the move. It's one that I think most people saw coming for at least a little bit now, and at least I'm talking a couple days. And I think one thing that's important to bring up, or I guess not important to bring up, but something I will bring up, Ian Rappaport, right after the national championship game ended, tweeted that per himself, Al Golden was linked to the Bengals, right, on Monday night, as if we hadn't been talking about that for about 3 weeks, Craig. I thought that was a little interesting that it was per Ian Rappaport.
Yeah, per him. It was one of those, we say, it feels like we say this almost every year with different hires and everything, but this was like the worst kept secret in football.
Yeah.
Everybody at this point knew Al Golden was the guy. Everybody knew that as soon as the national championship game was over, that Al Golden was going to be potentially announced as the hire as soon as the next morning. Didn't happen the next morning. They waited. I guess they still haven't formally announced it, at least unless you've seen anything.
Not from the Bengals.
But not from the Bengals. But it seems like a done deal.
There's a lot of people getting fired if this is not the Bengals' next defensive coordinator.
Yeah. So worst kept secret in football. You talk about the Lions and the collapse that they had in their first playoff game, and then their offensive and defensive coordinators both immediately leaving for other head coaching jobs. And of course the questions begin, oh, were they not focused on the right things? Is that why the Lions lost their playoff game and all these things? So similar questions I'm sure will be asked about Al Golden.
For sure.
And Al Golden seemingly was the pick from the minute they fired Lou. And so there will be questions about that. But Lou was fired several weeks ago, and Al Golden was able to get Notre Dame to the national championship game. So I don't think that was as much of a problem as maybe some said. But nonetheless, Al Golden is the new defensive coordinator. Jerry Montgomery has since been announced, or reportedly agreed to become the defensive line coach, I should say, under Al Golden. Paul Dehner also reporting that they're close on a linebacker coach. Hasn't officially been willing to come forward with a name there, but does say that they are close with the linebacker coach. So that'll be something that we'll keep an eye out in the near future as well. And then the other piece of it, Jacob, that we haven't really talked about, that again, this is to talk about Al Golden, obviously, but the Bengals also went out and did finalize the hire and announced the hire for their offensive line coach, bringing in Scott Peters. I was really excited to see that hire as well. I know some people were down on the Patriots offensive line this year, but again, that talent was brutal in New England on the offensive line. But I look at Cleveland, where he was prior, and I personally thought that Cleveland had one of the better offensive lines in the league. So
no question about that.
For him to be brought in and be the offensive line coach, I'm excited about that hire as well. It feels like during this cycle, Zach or Mike, if you believe some people, have made some good hires, and I feel like they're bringing in some new mentality, some new mindsets. What was your reaction to the Scott Peters hire yesterday? I think
it was yesterday. Yeah. Look, I'm going to be honest with you. If I said I knew Scott Peters' name before we hired him, I would be lying. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but that's the truth. And I look up where he was and what he did and who his connections are to, and he was under Bill Callahan in Cleveland. And if that's not a gold star hire, then I'm not sure what is. A lot of people that are a lot smarter than I am are talking about how great he is, and I'm not talking about beat reporters or anything like that. I'm talking about NFL offensive linemen and NFL offensive line coaches. They're talking about how great of a hire this is, how he's an up-and-comer in the sport. There was an article written by one of the best O-line scouting department, unit departments for college and high school, that about how Scott Peters is the best up-and-coming O-line coach in terms of what he does schematically out of anyone in the country, in the league. And I thought that was really surprising to hear. And if the Bengals are able to get a guy who's viewed that highly across the entire league, I think that is about as great as it can come in terms of an offensive line hire. We did the household name at offensive line in Frank Pollock. I think there's probably more people that know that name than any O-line coach outside of Bill Callahan in the NFL because of, obviously his time in Dallas and everything along those lines. But the praise that Peters has been getting since we hired him and the amount of people coming out in support of that move, I think makes me feel about as good as any we've made so far this offseason.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. I'm gonna maybe dig myself a little bit of a hole here and apologize for that, but I think that this Bengals offensive line has the talent today to be a good offensive line in the NFL. And I know that everyone's going to point to Cordell Volson and Alex Kappa. Volson was a good enough offensive lineman early in his career. Alex Kappa, we went out and signed in free agency. All I'll say is that I wouldn't be surprised to see improvements out of this offensive line, and that may or may not include Alex Kappa and Cordell Volson. Pretty confident it won't include Alex Kappa.
I was going to say not Alex Kappa, right?
But
yeah.
but if Cordell Volson is a starting guard next year, first of all, I wouldn't be surprised. But second of all, is that I'll hold out judgment on that decision until I see what they are able to do, because even though we saw career years out of guys like Orlando Brown, and we saw significant improvement out of guys like Amarius Mims, the truth of the matter is that we saw a step back from the interior,
no question,
linemen.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited to see what this new offensive line coach can come in and do, Scott Peters, and see if he does have an opportunity to turn some things around in Cordell Volson. He's still young, obviously struggled this year, but Cordell Volson isn't a guy who, coming into this year, a lot of people were looking at and saying, oh, he's a terrible offensive lineman. And yet that's where we are today. His PFF grades have never been great, but we never looked at him as quite the liability that we look at him as today. And so I'm interested to see, does that change at all if he's still the starting guard next year, or maybe he just provides you depth. I mean, there's no problem with having a guy who has appeared in however many NFL games, started however many NFL games. I think he's up over 40 something now, as your backup guard. Obviously the ideal situation is that you have a starting line that you trust and that you can throw out there. But between Cordell Volson, Cody Ford, who showed the ability to kind of go back and forth between tackle and guard, I still want to draft a guard. I still want to see what we have in Matt Lee, but
Cody Ford,
I don't know. I think he provides the flexibility Cody Ford does to be able to play guard or tackle.
Do you think there's any chance he's our starting guard week 1 next year?
There's a chance for anything, Jacob. I mean,
that's kind of where I'm thinking right now. One of the two spots.
I think Kappa's gone, right? So you're going to have to draft or sign an offensive guard.
There will be at least one new body at offensive guard.
100%. The question becomes, is he a starting guard
Correct.
that we go out and sign? Is he a backup guard that you go out and sign? Do you sign a veteran on a 1 or 2 year deal with the hope of developing a draft pick behind him that you spend in the 3rd or 4th round this year to bring in an offensive guard? I don't know. What I do know is that they're going to be bringing in a completely new philosophy and a offensive line coach who, at least from an outsider's perspective, has the ability to develop talent and offensive guards that have shown the ability in the past to be starting guards in the NFL. And so I don't know. I'm sure I'll get burned in the chat and in the comments later for that, but I'm going to actually hold out a little bit of judgment on our offensive line until I see what Scott Peters is able to do.
I agree with you, by the way. I think the 3 outside of the guards, Karras, Mims, and Orlando Brown, is up there with the most talented trios in those 3 positions in the entire league, especially if you're as high on Amarius Mims as I am and believe Orlando Brown can get back to where he was pre-injury, which I think at the very least everyone in Cincinnati believes that. I don't know how far that stretches, but before he got hurt this year, he was playing like a top 5 tackle in all of football, and Amarius Mims just kept getting better and better and better all year, and I think everyone believes in him. And Ted Karras was next to the 2 worst guards in the NFL, and he put up a top 5 to 10 center season in the league. So I think we have some pretty good O-line talent, as crazy as that might sound, talking about this year. Move on from Kappa, bring someone in, and hopefully hit on that addition, and then you're sitting pretty. I think there's a lot of, and this is what I was talking about earlier, with where the optimism comes from when you talk through this roster a little bit more. The position groups that are problems, you can make those problems disappear by just believing in a couple of young guys. And I think that's the biggest thing as we go through this offseason and that's why they went out and got a guy like Al Golden to emphasize that development, because the future of this Bengals team is going to rely on the people that are already in the building. And I understand we have to make additions. We have to go sign people on defense. We have to go sign a guy at guard. We have to go, obviously re-signing T. Higgins and Jamar, but that's part of what I'm talking about here. The people that were on the 2024 Cincinnati Bengals are going to be the people that make the 2025 Cincinnati Bengals win. And the additions are going to have to play crucial roles, but getting guys like Myles Murphy, DJ Turner, Dax Hill, Logan Wilson, and Jermaine Pratt back to where they were. The young guys, Chris Jenkins, McKinley Jackson in the middle. You raise the level of the players we already have, then you can go get those bargain signings that the Bengals have been able to do in the past, which in all likelihood is probably what they're going to do already. So whether those guys in the building play well or not, that's going to be what it comes down to. And I think that's why I'm trying to push myself as hard as I can into that optimism corner, because when we get to week 1, I just can't convince myself that the Bengals are going to go out and get big name player after big name player. We're going to have to believe in the guys we already have.
Yeah, and Zach Taylor talked about it during press conferences throughout the year and even after the year about how he believes in the guys in the building and how they're going to have to figure it out. This is the MO for the most part is not for this Bengals team to go out and make huge signings. They go out, they try and find older veterans who are able to come in and fill roles on a smaller deal than maybe they would have gotten earlier in their career. They come in, they mentor guys. They serve as, serviceable cogs in the machine for a short period of time, and then they move on. And so, with the exception of a guy like Trey Hendrickson, who obviously was brought in on a 4-year deal, it just has been kind of the MO. So they've already made kind of their big signings in Orlando Brown and in Trey Hendrickson. But I don't see them going out and making a huge signing elsewhere in free agency, because their big signings this year are going to have to be Jamar Chase and T. Higgins.
Right.
And we can't lose sight of the fact that they have other places they have to spend money. And I don't know that they're going to be spending money on big premium contracts on other positions, given the fact that they're going to have to put so much money into escrow for those two guys as well.
That's the biggest thing I think a lot of people, I don't know if disregard or dismiss or maybe don't even know, but most of the conversation around Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are people figuring out how it works within the cap and saying it works relatively easily. Let's just get it done, bang, 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 and move on. That's not the part the Bengals are struggling with. The Bengals aren't struggling with how to fit those contracts within the cap. Obviously, that's something to worry about and work around, but the biggest issue for the Bengals with these two major extensions is the guaranteed money and how you have to give it to them. The Bengals don't have this kind of cash. So going out and finding big other deals that also work within the cap, you have to think about how much cash the Bengals have. Any big deal requires guaranteed money, and that guaranteed money has to go into escrow, and Mike Brown can't do that. So we'll see what happens this offseason, but those two major signings, obviously the next two steps. We had step 1, which was the defensive coordinator or any other coaching moves, and we seem like those are dropping like dominoes now. Al Golden, obviously the first one to fall, and we'll fill out the rest of the defensive staff here, I'm sure, as the week rolls on. Now we move on to the offseason, and we'll be back to talk about the draft soon and free agency and everything along those lines. I'm thrilled. I really am thrilled. I thought we would be here at some point talking about an Al Golden hire, and I'm glad the Bengals got it done. It was his first decision. He was their first decision as soon as they fired Lou, and they stuck with it, and they got the job done. They brought him to Cincinnati, coaxed him out of Notre Dame as a guy who just signed an extension there last offseason, has already talked about how much he loved his time at Notre Dame, but he wanted to come back to Cincinnati, and I think that's a pretty dang cool thing for a pretty really good coach. So good hire in my book for the Cincinnati Bengals today at defensive coordinator in Notre Dame's Al Golden.
Yeah, like we said earlier, I would just encourage everybody to hold out any judgment on anything before we get too off the rails. I mean, Al Golden, look, here I meant to say this earlier in the show, and I don't want to extend the show too much longer.
No,
but
you're good.
We talked when they fired Lou about the value of bringing in a former head coach in Robert Saleh or Dennis Allen or somebody else to be the defensive coordinator and to support Zach Taylor. Al Golden has been a head coach, and I realized it was at the collegiate level, but he was a pretty darn successful one at that. And you look at the success that he had at Temple, literally parlayed him into being in the Temple Hall of Fame, Athletics Hall of Fame, with the success that he had. So I'm happy with it. I think that Al Golden actually brings more to the table than maybe some people are giving him credit for right now in terms of his experiences, which is fine. Give it time. I'm excited about it. I think that, there was a lot of people who wanted to go out and make splash hires, which is not the way the Bengals operate. But nonetheless, the real success of this team in 2025 is going to come down to two things, and that's the development of the players on the team and who they add. and half of that is yet to be determined. So I'm gonna hold out until August before I make any formal decisions on how I'm feeling. And
I'll force you into a formal decision on some things by August, I'm sure. That's a long time for me to back you in a couple corners, so we'll be all right. We'll be all right.
We'll be fine. We'll be fine.
Well, Craig, thanks for joining me today. Big time news to kick off the offseason for the Bengals, bringing in Al Golden to be the new defensive coordinator in Cincinnati, ex-Bengals linebackers coach. Now the DC. We'll see how the rest of that staff fills out as the week rolls on. We'll be back with Chatterbox Bengals leading up to the draft, going through free agency, and any other news that could revolve around the Bengals. We'll have it right here. Thank you guys for joining us. Make sure you like the stream on your way out. And Houday. Feels good to say that again.